Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are tearing into a brand new, completely counterintuitive 2026 empirical study about startup structures. We're looking at a fascinating piece of research from a team of economists at the University of Texas and the University of Pittsburgh. It's titled Rebuilding Startups, an empirical study on remote work and skill complementarity. And let me tell you, it takes absolutely everything we think we know about the future of work and just flips it entirely on its head.
So picture the standard narrative around remote work in the startup world. We all kind of assume that going remote creates this flat, anti-corporate utopia, right? You picture a bunch of independent digital nomads working from a beach in Bali, communicating asynchronously, with absolutely zero middle management breathing down their necks. We just assume physical distance naturally leads to a flatter org chart. Well, brace yourselves because the data says the exact opposite. This massive new study reveals that when startups adopt remote work, it actually leads to significantly more hierarchy. We're talking more managers, more layers, and much taller organizational structures. Okay, let's dive into this, because solving this specific paradox tells us something fundamental about how brilliant teams are actually built.
All right, Section 1, the startup talent constraint. To get the punchline of this study, we first got to understand the fundamental problem every young, ambitious startup faces before remote work is even in the picture.
Startups are in a brutally tough spot. They've got these massive growth aspirations, but they are dealing with incredibly fragile early structures and super tight financial budgets. But here's the real kicker. The tasks in a startup are highly interdependent. You can't just operate in a silo. Every single person's work deeply affects everyone else's. Because of this, startups desperately need highly specialized talent just to survive. But if they only hire locally, they are caught in a trap. They're forced into compromises, basically hiring whoever is geographically closest and willing to work for startup wages, rather than finding the absolute perfect puzzle piece for their specific needs.
So how do they break out of that trap? That brings us to Section 2, decoding skill complementarity. This is the secret weapon that solves the talent constraint. Now, it's a dense economic concept, but we can decode it with a pretty relatable analogy.
We really need to look at the difference between substitutability and complementarity. Think of building a startup, like putting together a heist crew, or, a band. If you hire 5 drummers, well, you haven't really built a great band. Actually, scratch that. It's not even a band. It's just a drum circle. Those skills are substitutable. They just overlap and replace each other. But if you hire a drummer, a bassist, a guitarist, and a singer, now you have complementarity. You've hired people whose different, distinct skills actually multiply each other's overall value.
The researchers define this formally, and it's absolutely crucial. Skill complementarity is the extent to which workers' distinct skills interact synergistically, so their joint contribution exceeds the sum of their individual contributions. I really want to emphasize that phrase. Joint contribution exceeds the sum. It's a super additive relationship. Literally, 1 + 1 = 3. This right here is the holy grail for a startup's early-stage development and innovation. Now, measuring this? Incredibly tricky, but the researchers pulled off an amazing detective trick here. They used a network-based approach, crunching millions of LinkedIn profiles, job postings, and worker mobility data. They tracked specific skills, like Python programming paired with cloud architecture. First, they looked for synergy, meaning how often these skills naturally show up together in successful companies. But they didn't stop there. To find true complementarity, they took that raw synergy score and subtracted substitutability. Basically, they filtered out all the skills that just do the exact same interchangeable job. What you're left with is pure, isolated complementary magic, completely different skills that desperately need each other.
Okay, now that we know what skill complementarity is, let's hit Section 3, the remote work catalyst. Let's see what actually happens to the data when startups flip the switch on this model.
Now, what's really interesting about this regression setup on the screen is the sheer rigor of the analysis. It is absolutely wild. The researchers didn't just look at a handful of companies. They tracked over 2,200 startups. That generated almost 30,000 data observations between the first quarter of 2021 and the second quarter of 2025. They focused specifically on this post-pandemic window to make sure remote work was a deliberate, strategic hiring choice, not just a mandated lockdown fluke. Their main variable in this table is remote intensity, which is simply the proportion of a startup's remote job postings. And to make this a totally airtight statistical environment, they controlled for macroeconomic trends, unchangeable company traits, and they even used rolling entry matching to pair startups that went remote with near-identical startups that didn't.
And out of that airtight environment comes a massive finding. A 1 standard deviation increase in remote job postings increases a startup's workforce skill complementarity by 13.4% relative to the sample average. By removing those physical geographic borders, startups finally gain access to the exact bassist and singers they need to complete their band, rather than just settling for another local drummer.
Now, I know some of you data skeptics out there are screaming, wait, is this just correlation? Well, the researchers anticipated that. To prove a strict causal link, they utilized instrumental variable, which you can see here, called peer remote intensity. They looked at the remote work adoption rates of a startup's competitors. Because a startup has to compete for talent, a rival going remote forces the startup to do the same, which acts as an external shock to the system. Using this instrument, the data held strong. Offering remote work directly and strictly causes this 13.4% spike in talent synergy, no doubt about it.
But check out this fascinating nuance in the bar chart. The researchers broke the data down between fully remote roles and hybrid roles. As you'll see, fully remote roles drive this complementarity up significantly. Hybrid roles, on the other hand, just don't have the same magical effect. And logically, this makes perfect sense. If a role is hybrid, the candidate still has to commute to the office a few days a week. You are still trapped in your local geographic talent pool, meaning you still face the exact same constraints in finding that perfect complementary puzzle piece. So we have our perfectly matched puzzle pieces. So why do things suddenly get so complicated? Let's look at Section 4, the shift toward hierarchy. Let's walk through this organizational pipeline and see how it builds. Step 1, the startup adopts remote work. Step 2, this immediately opens up a geographically diverse talent pool. Step 3, they hire from this pool, which leads to a massive increase in skill complementarity. But Step 4 is the kicker, skyrocketing coordination costs. Remember, complementary skills are highly interdependent. The programmer needs the designer, who needs the marketing lead. When you have brilliant, highly specialized experts working together, but miles apart, natural friction and coordination chaos are going to emerge. So how does the startup survive Step 4? Step 5, the addition of formalized management layers. To prove this, we have to dive into this table excerpt measuring what the researchers call organizational flatness. It's a pretty straightforward metric. A higher number means a flatter company, while a lower number means a taller, more hierarchical structure. And if you look at the columns tracking remote intensity against flatness, the data definitively points to a negative association. As remote intensity goes up, organizational flatness goes down. It's right there in the numbers. Remote work directly leads to taller, much more layered company structures.
And this next table brilliantly illustrates the exact mechanism at play. It's a mediation analysis. The researchers found that the addition of hierarchy isn't just random, aimless corporate bloat. If you look at how skill complementarity functions as a mediator here, it shows that the hierarchy is directly triggered by that specific increase in complementary skills. When startups hire these diverse, interlocking experts, they suddenly desperately need someone to conduct the orchestra. The managers are hired specifically to align and orchestrate this highly complex, interdependent talent base.
Section 5, Building the Future Startup. Let's bring this whole narrative home. What is the practical, real-world application of this highly counterintuitive data for founders, HR leaders, and really anyone building a company today? It requires a complete, ground-up reframing of how we view management. Let me read this quote directly from the researcher's conclusion. Structural adjustments toward greater hierarchy may not necessarily be viewed as inefficiencies. Rather, they may represent a productive organizational response. Think about that for a second. We are so conditioned to think of middle management as a bad thing, as this sluggish bloat that slows a startup down. But this study proves that hierarchy is actually the necessary operating system required to unlock the massive value of a perfectly optimized remote superteam. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative question to challenge your assumptions about the whole future of work. If you are running a startup right now, you have to ask yourself, is your startup flat because it's truly agile and efficient, or is it flat simply because your local talent pool is too homogeneous and simple to require a conductor? Embracing remote work might mean embracing hierarchy for sure, but according to the data, it's the exact hierarchy you need to scale. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.